We'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Rita Lucarelli. She is an associate professor of Egyptology at UC Berkeley, where she works on religion, magic, and demonology in ancient Egypt, as well as its reception in the contemporary world. I'm really excited to learn about protective demons today in her talk called Inverted of Face, Violent of Voice, Benevolent Protectors with Scary Names, and How to Think About Demons in Ancient Egypt. Dr. Lucarelli.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here today. This is a recording, but I'll be there in person to discuss the lecture that I'm going to present now. The title of this panel is Redeeming Demons. But what are demons? Scholars have been working on demonology, and they continue to struggle and still do when trying to define the entities they want to talk about. The search for an alternative term, less morally loaded than the modern English word demon, has brought Egyptologists to talk about daimones rather than demons, although the Greek term is also problematic, supernatural beings, liminal beings, semi-divine creatures, genie, and so on. However, as Tal Assad, an anthropologist of Islam, wrote in a famous essay, Thinking About Beliefs, Religion, and Politics, to define is to repudiate some things and endorse others. The concept of demons, similar to that one of God, varies in individual minds and vary enormously in different cultural contexts, so that to attempt defining such a concept anonymously could be risky. Defining demons is even more difficult within the field of religious studies, where God beliefs has been for too long considered the essence of religion, according to the Judeo-Christian Islamic prototype of religion. According to such a prototype, a society is religious when it has belief in one or more beings that can be seen as God. In 1994, William Padden wrote in its Religious Words book, gods are, you can see it here, are central, unavoidable subject matter for the study of religious life. But the God beliefs cultural model or worldview according to which we can claim that certain people believe certain gods are in end an abstraction and assumption made by scholars in order to easily describe a particular religion. The search for definition becomes even more complex when the concept of God when to the concept of God we add those of monsters, demons, and Mishwesen, hybrid beasts, in ancient and modern religion. In order to define and build a taxonomy of semi-divine and supernatural beings and differentiate them from gods, thinking about agency helps to build a discourse around these ontologies. A discourse on agency in religion would be too long for this talk, but what is important to say it is that while we are used to see agency, namely acting for producing something as a quality mainly human, and for those who believe in one or more gods, also divine, in many cultures, ancient and modern, agency applies also to the world of animals and plants. Anthropological studies like the one of Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, Cannibal Metaphysics, provided direct evidence on how the human mind can discover that trees, animals, plants not only have agency, but also inner personas, exactly like humans and despite their different looks. This notion is what in anthropology is called perspectivism, which I find useful when thinking about gods and demons and about how the ancient Egyptians or other thought about them. Perspectivism, with its multiplicity of approaches, could maybe be seen in dichotomy with a worldview controlled by logic and a clear distinction between true and false, good and evil. Demons and monsters were seen as agents, although non-human, and we should avoid also to ascribe to them human perspectives, applying categories such as good versus evil. In other words, we should accept then, in a world of demons and monsters, ancient and modern, the borders between humankind and its surrounding are blurred, muddied, and ambiguous. It is not a coincidence that ambiguous beings live in ambiguous, mutable spatiotemporal zones such as desert or the wild, and in liminal spaces symbolized by water and fire, which we see represented in ancient as well as in modern visuals of the supernatural. The witch house of the dark folk tale of Hansel and Gretel, of the Grimm brothers, recently represented in the movie whose flyer I'm using here, can be compared to the dangerous nature of the so-called lake of fire of the ancient Egyptian netherworld, where the deceased could end up being devoured by Amemet, the devourer of the dead, a composite animal with the head of a crocodile, the body of a hippo and a lion, hybrid being that, according to a Western perspective, we would call monstrous. The idea of monster is indeed connected in our mind to an image. In a central study on ancient monsters, David Wengrow proposed to replace such a term, monster, with that of composites. Wengrow's discourse is centered in a recognition of what he calls the first stage of mechanical reproduction in Mesopotamia, and the mechanical reproduction would be the mass production of identical copies of a text using technological means, so like printing, and referring to Walter Benjamin's 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Benjamin, though, did not go back in searching evidence earlier than ancient Greece. In such an age, which is also connected to the birth of human life, monsters would be disturbing images because of the incongruous combination of body parts taken by two or more species as a sort of threatening message from nature showing how it can act out of balance and logic. Given also the moral implication of the Latin root monstrum as a sign of misfortune and evil omen, Wengrow prefers to speak more neutrally of composites, also inspired by Philippe Descolat's work on hybrid image-making traditions such as totemism and what Descolat calls analogistic ontologies. For Descolat, analogism is a mode of identification that divides up the whole collection of existing beings into a multiplicity of essences, forms, and substances separated by small distinctions and sometimes arranged on a graduated scale so that it becomes possible to recompose the system of initial contracts into a dense network of analogies that link together the intrinsic properties of the entities that are distinguished in it. With these inspiring notions in mind, when looking at the pictorial and textual evidence of the ancient Egyptian beings populating the netherworld, we can look at the bodies of the demons becoming composite images of analogies with the main function, that one of guiding the deceased to recognize them and pass through the regions that they protect. Seshem in ancient Egypt is the root for the verb to guide, and Seshemo is also a word for images as divine manifestation, as recently pointed out also by Arun Neard in his study on ancient Egyptian images, Seeing Perfection. Protection is a key word when attempting to understand the world of the ancient Egyptian demons and monsters populating the other world. a protective mode of image transmissions as seen in the dense distribution of composite figures in scenes of the ancient Egyptian netherworld has been hypothesized by Vengrove as well, which also involves issues of cultural transmission and epidemiology of representations, as he calls those images made as defense and protection from danger, which are the hybrid bodies of demons, often holding knives and guarding gates and passages in the realm of the dead, and having names that speak of their agency of protection and defense. The watchers, the murderers, the wanderers, the squatting ones, the devourer. Differently from other cultures and religions, ancient and modern, the ancient Egyptians did not catalog primordial figures of monsters and demons into ontologies defined by ethics of good versus evil. In our Western mind, instead, heavily influenced by the Catholic religion, monsters and demons need to be hunted down, give them names, and control them, rationalizing them. In a book on monsters in popular culture by Liz Gloin, the author speaks of cryptozoology, that is a rationalizing approach to ancient monsters, which we know never existed, so we think they are something else, and we try to find out what they really are. It is really hard, though, try to find out the historical real origins of monsters and demons from antiquity. Was Apopis a python snake? How can we possibly know for sure? However, these ancient monsters and demons survived until our times because their function corresponds to human archetypal needs of protection or to human fears of illness and death. Therefore, it is their function that we can all at least try to grasp more than their historical origin. Demonic agents with the function of protecting gates and regions of the netherworld and strictly related to those spaces are probably the most popular figures of the Book of the Dead due to the extreme popularity that the vignettes of those spells mentioning them had on different media, from papyrus to coffin and tomb walls, to mention the most popular ones. The fact that they have visible bodies whose depiction accompany the textual mentions of their names, epithets, and function helps the deceased to recognize and know the demon. The guardian's iconography is indeed an integral part of the exclusive knowledge about the Duat provided by the Book of the Dead corpus to the dead. The visualization of each guardian empowers the place that the deceased has to pass through, the gate, the door, the region. And it is significant that many of the guardians' names or epithets refer to a physical characteristic that also speaks out of their agency. So we have a Sechet hair, Ashairu, face downward, numerous of shapes, Semti, the earer, Aheru, sad of voice, Dunhat, one who stretched out his brow, Seked hair, one with vigilant face, or Asebu, the radiant one. Their images are a substantial help for the deceased to also ritually enact the process of empowerment that the deceased goes through by successfully crossing the regions guarded by the watchers. Some of these creatures depicted in magical papyri or on tomb walls have not composite bodies. I call them animal powers, since they are depicted exclusively in the shape of animals that most of the time also symbolize a deity. They do not have a very well-determined spheres of agency, since they do not have any protective function towards the place where they live, neither aim at punishing the deceased. They are rather simply inhabiting the netherworld, and their agency can be seen as a sort of propensity to consider the deceased passing by as a prey. Therefore, in such an interaction, the deceased wants to ward them off. Eduardo Kohn, in his splendid book, How Forest Thinks, discussed the human fear to become prey for non-human, mostly animal beings, in relation to the belief in master spirits among the Amazonian indigenous Runa people. And animal beings in the netherworld are also powerful manifestations of deities, and the disease aims at acquiring the shape-shifting ability to transform into them. So we have the spells, so-called, of transformation in the coffin text and Book of the Dead. The demonic animal powers that I analyze in my upcoming book on demonology mostly are represented in Book of the Dead papyri, like the one on these slides, where the deceased wants to ward off or interact with in order to get their favor, and are mentioned and represented in the group of spells for warding off dangerous beings. Animals are also used for conceptualizing demonic power in antiquity and in modern religion as well. The hybrid body of demons, differently from the animal powers, are placed in a specific landscape or space that speaks out of the kind of agency they have. Guardian figures are generally depicted close to gates, doors, or liminal and passage spaces, while punishers and animal powers act in areas devoted to the final judgment, such as the lake of fire or the hall of the two truths, or are identified in a netherworldly space where the deceased is warding them off with the gesture of pointing the finger or spearing them. I also like to differentiate land, landscape, space, and place, and follow Tim Ingold's take on the subject in his book, The Perception of the Environment. The landscape is not the same as space, according to Ingold's dwelling perspective. The landscape is a sort of enduring record of the past in which to engage with the past and its spaces and places. If applied to the ancient Egyptian depictions and textual description of the netherworld, for instance, the latter is the landscape whose spaces and places are the different regions the deceased traveled through, and the gates guarded by demons he or she has to pass through. The importance of the landscape in the magical agency of the Book of the Dead compositions and in magical texts in general is self-evident when analyzing the sources on different media, from papyrus to tomb wall. It generates from the need of protecting the space where humankind lives on earth and where the deceased travels after death. Magic and space are closely connected in many cultures, and in ancient Egypt in particular, through the concept of protection. Jan Assmann also talked in an essay, Invisible Religion, on situative Verankelung, that means a situational anchorage, provided by images used for protecting a space. The landscape on Earth, in particular the desert, is connected to the demonic also in other ancient religions, where it generates a topography of catastrophe, as mentioned by Frankfurt in his Evil Incarnate book. Even when there are no images depicting the landscape and space where the demonic figures function and where the encounter with the deceased occurs, generally the text mentions the place where each specific being lives or comes from. Demonic body and spatial dimension form therefore a unity, while the space where the demon lives contribute to her or his own identity. At the same time, the demonic figures characterizing and owning each particular landscape. Therefore, each category of demonic agents needs to be analyzed in close relation to the space and landscape where they function. The theme of protecting and guarding places, especially gates and passages in a netherworld, often characterized as underworld, is present also in Christian literature in relation to the descent of Christ to hell and the role of watchers. To conclude, in the light of the evidence brought above, how we redeem ancient Egyptian demons from the assumption that they are symbols of danger and fear? Do we even need to redeem them, since Egyptologists are still debating if demons and monsters should be considered in separate ontologies from the gods? A peculiar approach to the definition of demons is given in an essay that Dieter Kurt wrote in a volume of collected studies in 2003. His analysis is based on the comparison between the concept demons, gods, and magic religion, since these pairs are intrinsically connected and difficult to separate. In his attempt to define borders for these two spheres of thought, Kurt matched the pair demons magic to the sphere of action, and that one of religions gods to the sphere of contemplation. Demons result therefore as a symbol of the dynamic, less abstract part of the ancient Egyptian religious thought, compared to the more intellectual and contemplative nature of the gods. Although this definition raises many questions on how to interpret then that mix of ritual, magical, and cultic elements forming the personal piety in ancient Egypt, especially in later periods, Kurt's study helped to define at least the nature of demonic power, which is partial and directed towards a single specific aim at time, compared to the universal almighty power of the gods. In my upcoming book, I've chosen to call demons and monsters agents of protection, punishment, disease, according to the context where they act. I believe that in order to give to demonology the right place within the study of the ancient Egyptian religion and culture, we need a comparative approach in the study of our material and textual sources with other religions of the ancient as well as of the modern world. Considering Egypt as a unique civilization whose religious beliefs cannot be compared with other people and cultures is a rather dehumanizing approach and also colonial approach. If demons exist in so many cultures worldwide, why they shouldn't be counted within the ancient Egyptian worldview? Moreover, when having to choose the terminology to define ontologies, I think it is important to focus on the question of translation versus the understanding of a concept when we face two languages with different conceptual systems. As brilliantly discussed by Lakoff, speakers of different languages and belonging to different cultures still share the same basic experiences, as for instance beliefs in demons, and conceptualize the same domains of experience to roughly the same degree. Therefore, I'd like to conclude this talk with a quote from Lakoff's book, Woman, Fire, and Dangerous Things. Translation can occur without understanding, and understanding can occur without the possibility of translation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful talk. Next up, we have Dr. Joshua Roberson. He is an associate professor of art history and Egyptian language at the University of Memphis. He's researched and published on ancient Egyptian cosmological texts, their locations, and all the demons that live in those locations. He'll be discussing the god Aker, the god that guards the entrance and the exit to the underworld. In his talk today, The Bones of the Earth Spawn Tremble, reassessing the Aker Sphinx personification or guardian demon. I'm very excited.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us and me this evening. I would like to begin by thanking our hosts at Cal State San Bernardino and ARCE-OC, and in particular the organizers Eva Kirsch, Kate Liska, and Brian Kramer for their kind invitation to speak with you tonight on an obscure ancient Egyptian creature known as Aker. All right, let's get to work. The title of my talk comes from the so-called Cannibal Hymn, one of the most ancient spells from the Pyramid texts, which is the oldest corpus of magical texts known to scholarship. The spell is interesting for many reasons, not least because of its presumed antiquity, but also its evocative descriptions of the king laying claim to cosmic powers by cooking and eating people, spirits, and even the gods themselves. However, our interest today lies with the very first line of this lengthy magical recitation, which you can see highlighted in blue here on the lower right. In this selection, which sets the stage for the cosmic drama that is about to unfold, we read, "Flooding the sky, the stars grow dark. With quaking bows, Aker's bones tremble." The Egyptian creature named in the second line of this couplet, Aker, whose hieroglyphs you see here, is an obscure being mentioned for the very first time in this passage from the Pyramid of Unas. It is the nature of this entity that I will investigate in my presentation today. Unfortunately, the rest of the cannibal hymn says nothing else about him. Nevertheless, the context of this opening couplet does allow us to make some educated guesses. The first line describes the sky explicitly, using a verb for flooding that underscores the watery nature of that region as the Egyptians conceived it. The second line, by contrast, uses verbs for quaking and trembling, which suggest a rumbling of the earth. Thus, we might surmise that Aker stands here for the personified earth in contrast to the sky. Apart from the cannibal hymn, 9 other pyramid text spells mention Aker for a total of 10 attestations. These spells provide additional context, which helps us to understand his nature in this early period. These associations include body parts, of which Aker is said to possess bones, arms, fingers, and a face. He is connected to Horus, which is to say the deceased king. In addition, he is associated on multiple occasions with Geb, the personified earth, and Shu, the personified air. Aker is described as a dangerous entity who poses a threat not only to serpents and other creatures from the earth, but also to the deceased themselves. And finally, Aker is said to either be or perhaps to possess a gate within the earth. So, given these associations, the question then becomes, what manner of being is Aker? As we saw in the cannibal hymn, he appears to personify the earth, or some part of it, but is he only a personification? After all, he is associated on multiple occasions with important gods like Shu and Geb, who also personify parts of the cosmos. So does Aker possess a comparable divine status? If not, then is he perhaps a lesser divinity, one of the so-called demons, which are the subject of this very conference? We can start to answer some of these questions by examining the roles that Aker plays in the pyramid texts, whether passive or active. The passive roles and situations in which Aker can occur include being traversed by the deceased, being opened, having his face in particular opened by Horus, who is the deceased, having his gate within the earth opened, having his arms in the earth opened. In addition, Aker's fingers can become entangled with dangerous animals, and he can tremble with the rest of the personified cosmos, as we saw in the cannibal hymn. Finally, we learn that Aker can be burnt with flame in order to protect the deceased. Of course, by implication, this tells us that Aker can threaten the deceased because he can be burned in order to protect them. Aker can open the face of Horus, just as Horus can open his face. Aker can serve the deceased in some unspecified capacity. In addition, and quite interestingly, Aker can produce lesser versions of himself, which are called the Akeru or Aker spawn. Apparently, these are serpents who can seize the deceased and hinder their progress. And finally, Aker can jump up and seize dangerous serpents, such as those that he spawns to threaten the deceased. This list tells us something important about Aker. Namely, it tells us that he possesses agency because he is capable of actively doing things. As a result, it is more likely that he is more than just a personification of the earth. Another important clue as to Aker's nature can be observed in the way that his name was spelled, specifically in the sense signs known as classifiers or determinatives that were added after the phonetic signs in his name. I have arranged the various spellings from the pyramid texts from less iconic, which is to say giving fewer clues visually to the creature's form and function, to more iconic spellings on the right, which provide more visual clues as to Aker's nature. So in its simplest form, they simply spell his name with no classifier and no additional information about what sort of creature Aker might be. In addition, they might spell the name Aker as Akru, suggesting an Ak lion. We don't know what the word Ak might mean, but Ru is clearly the word for lion, suggesting that Aker possesses a leonine countenance or perhaps a leonine nature in his function within the earth. Aker and his offspring can be determined with a divine falcon. This tells us that they were considered to be deities, but it's a generic identification. It doesn't tell us anything about the kind of deity that they were, what sort of divinity they possessed. Aker and his offspring might be classified with strips of land, stressing their connection to the earth, where the deceased were buried and where serpents emerged. Aker, in his leonine aspect, might be classified with a strip of land that was then anthropomorphized with 2 human heads. In addition, the anthropomorphized strip of land might be given the forequarters of a lion, suggesting the form of a sphinx. And finally, the personified land could be given 2 human heads and 2 lion forequarters, suggesting a double sphinx. Apart from the classifier variants themselves, we also observe in this list a diachronic trend, which is to say a pattern of change that becomes evident over time. As you can see beneath each spelling of Aker's name, I have provided the kings and the dynasties, followed by the number of each king within each dynasty, when the variants occur. What we observe is that the classifiers tend not only to become more iconic over time, but also that Aker himself becomes increasingly anthropomorphized in later periods. As we move from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom, the pyramid texts fall increasingly out of use, to be replaced with a parallel corpus of spells known as the coffin texts. The coffin texts, being closely related to the pyramid texts, in some cases even edited directly from the older corpus, concern many of the same themes, albeit with increasingly detailed mythological elements, stories, and characters. In this regard, Aker and his offspring, the Aker spawn, continue to appear in essentially the same roles observed already in the pyramid texts, as personifications of the earth, dangers to the deceased, but also as protectors who guard against the subterranean realm that Aker personifies. Equally, if not more revealing, however, are the classifier signs that accompany the spellings of Aker's name. In the coffin text, Aker and his Aker spawn might be classified with a seated god. So as in the pyramid text, this identifies him as a deity, but it further identifies him as an anthropomorphized expression of divinity. In addition, both Aker and the Aker spawn might be classified with serpents, the threat par excellence to emerge from the earth. As in the pyramid text, the Aker spawn might be classified with a strip of land that is anthropomorphized with 2 human heads. Again, as we saw in the pyramid text, that anthropomorphized strip of land might be given lion's forequarters, suggesting the form of a double sphinx. Innovative to the coffin texts, we find that both Aker and the Aker spawn might be given a Sethian determinative, suggesting that both the deity and his offspring were dangerous creatures who lived outside the normal ordered realm of the cosmos. In his leonine aspect, Aker might also be given an anthropomorphic divine determinative. And finally, the Aker spawn might be given a classifier in the form of a double lion. So the most innovative development in the coffin texts and in the history of our mysterious friend Aker comes from the so-called Book of Two Ways. This self-contained composition within the larger corpus of coffin texts is the first example of a mortuary text that is also illustrated with extensive depictions of the divine realm through which the sun god must travel, and the beings whom he meets on his journey. As such, the Book of Two Ways marks the beginning of what we might call the Egyptian cosmographic tradition. As it happens, the Book of Two Ways also includes the first illustration of Aker himself, visible here in the red square. As in several of the classifier signs discussed previously, we see that Aker was depicted as a strip of earth with human heads on either end. However, in this illustration, that strip of earth is also bent upwards in the shape of a high-prowed ship, within which stands the dead god Osiris, inside his protective shrine. To the left of the Aker scene, we observe also the sun god's bark, which has left the water and must now be towed via sledge over land, past the slaughtered serpent Apophis, and past the chamber where Aker protects Osiris. By the New Kingdom, the illustrated cosmographic tradition had become the preferred decoration of the royal burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings. The earliest of these New Kingdom books is the Amduat, which divides the sun's nocturnal journey into 12 regions or hours through which the sun must pass. In the 5th hour, we again encounter the double-headed creature Aker, shown in the red square here. As in the earlier Book of Two Ways, Aker is preceded by the sun god's boat, which has again left the water and must be dragged over land past the double-headed creature. Here we see a photograph of the pyramid-shaped mound that conceals Aker beneath the sun god's path in the Amduat. The text informs us that this region is called the mysterious path of the land of Sokar, whom you can see in the middle of the scene. He's the falcon-headed deity emerging from the coils of a many-headed serpent. Remarkably, even the sun god does not enter this region directly. Instead, only Isis is permitted to enter, in order to join her dead brother Osiris. Thus, as in the Book of Two Ways, Osiris is protected by Aker, but unlike that earlier book, the presence of Osiris is hidden, concealed inside of Aker as a great and mysterious, which is to say invisible, image. Inside the land of Sokar, the text labels the double-headed Sphinx as Aker who guards the secret flesh. In addition, each head is labeled as flesh, which guards his image and guards the secret flesh, together with the falcon-headed deity Sokar, who stands inside of the oval between Aker's heads. The secret flesh is presumably the corpse of Osiris, which Isis has come to meet, but which is not pictured here for pious reasons. Just beneath the oval of Sokar, we observe the waters of primordial creation, which the sun god cannot sail upon. It is the literal boundary between the created world and the uncreated infinity of chaos, where the corpse of Osiris is concealed and creation is renewed. The next image of Aker comes from the so-called Book of Caverns in the later New Kingdom. Unlike the earlier Aker scenes, the solar bark does not appear here. However, the sun god's encounter with Osiris is depicted explicitly. On the left of the scene, Osiris stands in his sarcophagus, facing the head and eye of the sun god Re, the whole group of which is encircled by a protective serpent. Alongside this image appears the Aker Sphinx, human-headed as in the Amduat, but now the entire body of the creature is visible. 4 goddesses, Tefnut, Nut, Isis, and Nephthys, stand on one side within the arms of Aker, according to the text. 3 gods, including the creator god Atum, stand on the other side of the Sphinx. The annotations around and on the body of Aker explain how the sun god pauses in his journey above the double Sphinx, as illustrated by the sun disk that hovers above the lion's body. Resting on Aker's back, the earth god Geb and the young sun Khepri in the form of a scarab appear, guarding, so the text tells us, the image that is inside of Aker. This secret, mysterious image, called the mystery that is in the underworld, is depicted beneath the body of Aker himself. We see this mysterious image in the photo on the upper left. The corpse of Osiris, with the sun disk hovering above it, causing his phallus to grow erect as vitality flows into his inert body, which gathers itself together to be revived. It is this image of solar revivification and the renewal of life and sexual potency, which the Amduat only hinted at but did not actually depict, but which is shown here for the first time in the Book of Caverns. We next encounter the double sphinx as a standalone scene in the tomb of Ramses IV, where he once again accompanies the sun god's boat, which rests on the sphinx's paired human heads. We can be fairly certain, on the basis of the images discussed previously, that the double sphinx here is, in fact, Aker. Nevertheless, the creature is not labeled explicitly as such. Rather, his heads are identified as perfect entrance and perfect emergence, using verbs that signify the sun's nightly entry and exit from the netherworld, which Aker himself personifies. The motif of the sunboat resting on the back of Aker appears next in the tomb of Ramesses VI. In addition to the sun and his entourage, the most notable addition to this later version is the king himself. Ramses appears twice, holding aloft the young sun disk, which rises up towards the Aker Sphinx. The king's importance to this scene is stressed through his double image and through the repetition of his name 3 times, including the bold proclamation, "King Ramses elevates the sun." As in the preceding image, the Aker Sphinx personifies the entire netherworldly realm through which the sun god passes, except that now the king, in both name and image, appears as a sort of structural support for the cosmos itself. From the same tomb of Ramses VI, we encounter a second image of the sun god atop the back of the Aker Sphinx. In this case, the Sphinx is labeled explicitly as Aker. Beneath Aker's body, we observe yet another image of the sun god's union with the deceased Osiris, whose mummy is labeled the corpse in which is the sun, while the sun himself appears directly above in the form of a disk that descends from Aker's cavern with an inverted falcon head expelling life-giving sunlight into the still inert corpse of Osiris. The final image of Aker, which we will examine today, comes again from the tomb of Ramses VI, where we see the double sphinx depicted for the first time now with the body and head of a lion, as opposed to the human-headed sphinx observed previously. Here, we encounter Aker in his most elaborate personification. Not merely the earth, or the underworld, not merely the guardian of the corpse of Osiris, but rather as the nexus of all reality, where creation meets oblivion and is thereby renewed. On the right, we see the sun god's boat in its night form as it plunges into the body of Aker, where it is received by the exalted earth, Tatinen, before being passed down into the primordial waters of chaos, the watery host of Nun. After plunging into the waters of chaos, the sun bursts forth as a rejuvenated solar disk, held aloft from the center of Aker's body by the arms of Nun, chaos personified. Finally, on the left, the sun reappears in his boat, which now assumes its daytime form as it is pushed up and out of the body of Aker, to resume its daytime journey and start the cycle over again. So, having seen how he appears and what he can do, we must ask again, who or what is Aker? Well, the answer is complicated. Originally, he was a rather threatening figure who seemed to embody all the terrors of the earth, which could threaten the dead on their journey. In the oldest spell, the Cannibal Hymn, he seems to personify the earth itself, but in subsequent spells, he was an active participant in the divine realm. And yet, he possessed no cult, and therefore he was not a god in the sense of the great gods of Egypt. He was rather a guardian demon, a lesser divinity, and a personification of the dangers over which he held authority, which were bound to specific locations and situations. By the Middle Kingdom, Aker had morphed into a protector of Osiris and a way station on the nocturnal journey of the sun. By the later New Kingdom, mobility and activity were eventually superseded by his role as a personification of the underworld, a sort of living passageway through which the sun could travel each night. At the same time, he retained his important function as the guardian of the corpse of Osiris and the location of the sun god's nightly union with his corpse. Ultimately, his body was depicted as the center point of creation itself, the horizon through which the sun god passed each morning and evening, the sum of the earth, and the nexus where the uncreated waters of chaos stopped and the ordered realm of the cosmos began. I thank you all for joining me on this trip down the esoteric backwaters of Egyptian cosmology, and I wish you a good night. I'll see everyone in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Next up, we have Brian Kramer. He is a research Egyptologist at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. His personal research looks at religion and ritual in ancient Egypt and the classical world, and he's particularly working on the Festival of Osiris at Abydos. He will be sharing some of his very exciting research today on good demons at Abydos in a talk called Demons in the God's Land, Menacing Creatures Used for Protecting Osiris in Abydos. Take it away, Brian.
Welcome to the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. My name is Brian Kramer. Today I'm talking to you about demons as they appear in the festivals of the god Osiris at the site of Abydos. So the term demon is used broadly in Egyptology to cover a category of beings found in religious art and texts that don't really fit well categories such as gods or human spirits. Very often, these kinds of demons have a menacing or a threatening demeanor, like these statues here. Today, I'm looking specifically at a category of demons called guardian demons, as Rita Lucarelli has defined them. See her talk in the other part of this conference. Today, these are animals and human-shaped creatures that were assigned to protect particular places. I'm looking in particular at guardian demons as they appear in the festivals of Osiris and Abydos. And I will try to explain how these demons could feature in the context of the actual performance of the festivals as an example of ritual practice in ancient Egypt. And it's interesting in this case because it's an officially state-sponsored religious event. And so this should hopefully be useful for looking at the question of demons in ritual because the festivals of Osiris and Abydos happens to be one of the religious cycles that we have some of the most evidence for from ancient Egypt. The festivals of Osiris and Abydos is a topic that I love. I've dealt with it in my dissertation. And this talk gives me an opportunity to look in more detail at some of the things that I find most interesting, the creatures that are invoked in the mysteries of Osiris. But unfortunately, I only have a few minutes to go over the festivals in hopefully enough detail, just enough, to give you the background for how I talk about the demons and where they fit into the picture. There's a lot of evidence for the festivals of Osiris, especially from the late New Kingdom into the Saite period. If you'd like to learn more about it, I would point you towards my talk at the American Research Center in Egypt's annual conference on April 20th. But a quick summary of the festivals is necessary to frame my talk about where demons fit into the picture. Egyptology has known quite a bit about the festivals of Osiris in Abydos for a long time. It's been over 100 years since Heinrich Schaeffer published this very informative stela of Echnofret, dating to the late Middle Kingdom. Schaeffer's analysis of this text has pretty much framed our understanding of the standard description of the festivals of Osiris and Abydos ever since. In the standard description of these festivals, priests were involved to bring a statue of the god Osiris out of his temple at Abydos, and they made a big procession with it into the desert up to the tomb of the first dynasty king named Jer at El Gab, the archaeological site. Then the statue was either buried there or it was brought back to the temple in another procession. That's the standard description you'll find in books today. But there's some very informative and important details that are missing from this standard description, which you need to know about to understand demons. And these are a few of them. First of all, there are actually two festivals of Osiris and Abydos. The first one is reflected in the sources like the Stela of Aker. It happened in the first month of the Egyptian calendar, and the second festival happened in the fourth month of the Egyptian calendar. It is reflected especially in the 7 books of the Koyak ritual, which is a long text inscribed on the walls in the shrine for Osiris found on the roof of the Ptolemaic temple at Dendera. And that's all I can say about the schedule, unfortunately, today. But if you're interested, again, look at my ARCE talk. I will be talking about how these two festivals got conflated over time. Another important point to learn about is that there are several stages in the performance of the festival of Osiris at Abydos. And these stages correspond with the locations of events that are found in the myth of the death and resurrection of Osiris in a place called Nedit. This myth is told to us in quite a lot of detail in a single ritual manual that survives from how the festivals were actually performed at Abydos. And that is the Sayite papyrus that was actually found at Abydos called P. Salt 825. The stages in this myth can be actually identified with various locations in the landscape at Abydos, where there are archaeological remains from the performance of the festivals. And it still blows my mind, having studied this for years, that you can go and see the exact places in Abydos where this all happened. It's unparalleled. Finally, there's an extremely important missing detail about the festivals in that it involved rituals that recreated the mythology of Osiris's death and his resurrection as a mummy. Specifically, it involved creating 2 statues of Osiris, one out of various aromatic, sticky, or precious substances, and another one out of clay and sprouting grain. The first statue is sometimes named Sokar, or He Insechti, another name for it. It would be ritually killed and decapitated in the festival. The second statue was sometimes called Gentiamentu, which means foremost of the Westerners, or he could be called the living one. And this was actually made as a headless body. During the course of the festivals, the head of the Sokar statue would then be attached to the body of the Gentiamentu statue. Ultimately, the festivals deposited that reconstructed statue of Osiris in a secret place in the desert called the ARCE-OC, which is a name that means perhaps the circuit of eternity or the limits of the horizon. It's a mysterious place. This final burial symbolized Osiris's mythological descent into the underworld, into the Duat, where he was the king of the dead. So how do demons fit into this picture? The creatures that we could call guardian demons occur in the festivals where they are placed to protect the statue of Osiris when it is in a perceived debilitated, weakened, or sleeping state. And that shouldn't really be very surprising. In fact, demons like this and images of demons are used throughout Egyptian magical and religious texts to protect people in similar states. Most of the guardian demons were employed, however, in the festival at Abydos only for a transitory period of time when the statues of Osiris were thought to need this assistance. But there is one case in the festival where there seems to be a perpetual demon guarding a special place in the landscape at Abydos. The first place where demons had a role was in the room where the 2 statues of Osiris were created. And this location is called the House of Shintayet in texts. It is a special room situated in the temple of Gentiamentu in Abydos. It has an analogous shrine on the roof of Dendera Temple. And in that shrine, also where these statues were made, there are images of what we might consider to be demonic figures. And they're placed around images of the creation of the statues of Osiris. These demons in Dendera are represented as little statues, such as statues of vultures or statues of rearing cobras. And these are supposed to magically prevent harmful forces from approaching that room while the statues of Osiris are being made, and they are in a perceived weakened state akin to being born. In Abydos, these very same guardian demons take the form of small clay statues of animals. Many of these have a hole in their mouth, and it's intended to hold something, probably something that represents a flame, or could even be intended to hold a real lit tapir. Snake statues among them have a text on them that actually names the statue, and in fact cajoles it to be vigilant and repel the Nehes creature, which is actually a name for the god Seth. The small clay statues of snakes in particular are used not just here, but in other places to protect sleepers, as Kasia Szpakowska has actually explained in several places. But the full complement of these statues from Abydos includes the imagery of other protective demon-like figures. It's not just snakes and vultures. These are not used commonly as magical protection for just anyone. Instead, what all of these animal form clay statues represent, I think, is a set of ritual objects that are mentioned in a specific text called the Confirmation of Royal Power, the New Year. In that text, it is specified that you need to make statues like this out of clay in order to protect the king while he sleeps in a ritual structure that is called the House of Life. For that reason, the text refers to them as the gods of the House of Life. A large group of these clay statues were discovered at Abydos in a specific spot on the exterior of the temple gate at the end of a road that leads down to the temple of Khentiamentu. In their vicinity, the excavators also found dishes that had images of various gods and labels for specific ingredients used in making the substance that we call, according to the Egyptian name for it, kufi. This was one of the substances that was actually used in the temples, and specifically was used to create statues of Osiris, such as the statue of Sokar. And I would then suggest that these little clay statues were used to protect the two statues of Osiris as they were being made in the temple, as is indeed depicted with those other statues on the roof of Dendera. And that they were then buried here, along with the dishes with the images of the gods and other temple refuse, as a respectful way of discarding them without breaking them, which is a no-no if you want to keep yourself in goodwill with the gods. These clay gods of the House of Life give us a very useful segue into the next place where demons occur in the imagery of the festivals. The House of Life was actually the name for a ritual structure that was created in the festivals at Abydos. And the way that you build a House of Life for Osiris is actually completely described, and in fact it is drawn in the papyrus Salt 825. This structure was supposed to be created to protect the statues of Osiris at a critical moment in the festivals. And it was protected by very specific things. It was protected, for example, by statues of the gods who were set up in almost a nativity scene-like around the statue of Osiris. It had copies of protected books inside of it. And it had teams of priests who would circulate around it who were singing books of protection in the day and night. And finally, it had barbecue pits set up around it, where priests would burn in effigy wax figures of enemies that might try to approach the structure. Salt 825 depicts these effigies in good detail, and it is mentioned among the kinds of books of protection that are placed in the House of Life that these are images of the god Seth and his accomplices. And among his accomplices, there are pictures of people who are probably intended to represent foreigners. The guardian demons of the House of Life include statues of protected beings similar to those that we saw in the clay statues. Salt 825 includes a very helpful illustration of how you put these statues together around the other two statues of Osiris as a form of protecting them. And this includes the statues of various formal Egyptian gods, such as the god Shu, the god Tefnut, Isis, Nephthys. But also among them, there are these kind of creatures that have a menacing demeanor and animal forms that we might call demons. The demonic figures in the House of Life can be divided into two distinctive roles. First of all, there are those who are in the House of Life in a way to kind of intimidate Seth. from even approaching the house of life. Among those, there are images of the snake-shaped protective goddesses and this lion-shaped god called Menti. The text in Psalm 825 declares that these statues have a light, that they light a flame during the night for Osiris. And so they are an interesting comparison to make with the statues of clay, which would have had some kind of thing inserted in their mouth, which may have represented a flame or have been a real flame. And then there are demons who have a role as slaughterers. The demons who have this role are actively kind of executing capital punishment on Seth and his accomplices. And they are mythologically associated with a particular place near Abydos and with the object called the slaughtering block. In Psalm 825, this place they're associated with is the town of Behdet of the east, where there was a temple at the site nowadays called Maga al-Meshech. And this site is directly across the river from Abydos. The location of Behdet being on the eastern side of the river is actually meaningful to the symbolism of this place as the slaughtering block for the enemies of Osiris, because it was on the eastern horizon that the slaughtering of the sun god's enemies happened at the rising of the sun in the morning. Apophis and his enemies and his accomplices were slaughtered there. Interestingly, Psalm 825 specifies that two particular ritual objects need to be brought from this town of Behdet: a staff and a butcher's knife. Presumably, these were then used to break and cut these kinds of execration figures. And there's where Behdet is. Among the slaughterer demons, there is a menacing lioness figure who's called Sekhmet, who's upon the slaughtering block. And the text notes that she puts the enemies, your enemies, to fire. Sekhmet was, of course, the goddess who was the punisher of the enemies of the sun. She's frequently represented as a lion. But this in particular image of her as the statue in the House of Life, I think, draws quite a comparison with the image of the god known as the swallower, Amet, who's depicted in the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, as the punisher for the deceased persons who are found unworthy to go into the realm of Osiris. Also among the slaughterer demons, there is a snake underneath a crocodile with a feather of Mot on his head. The text with this picture indicates that this was an image of the goddess Mut of Ishuru, Mut of South Karnak, who is frequently depicted as a female lioness, just like Sekhmet. And the text here declares that she too has a flame in her mouth. The squarish objects depicted around the snake in this picture are actually painted red. They don't show it here, but it's in the papyrus, they're red. And this is interesting because elsewhere in Psalm 825, that red color is directly associated with the burnt wax effigies of the enemies. They're the color used in the barbecue pits, for example. So it's probable here that this red, although it isn't stated, is involved in some kind of depositing of these effigies of the enemies. The crocodile on top is labeled "He who lives on ashes," and the feather is actually labeled "Mot the Great." A flame inside of her goes around in a complete circuit. And these names kind of give a clue that the purpose of these kinds of statues is not just to threaten enemies, but also to kind of create a burning and circling protection flame around Osiris. And then there's this image on the left here of a lion figure that's lying in an unusual posture on top of a box that actually represents the box that was specially designed to hold one of the statues of Osiris. Unfortunately, the papyrus doesn't name this creature, but it's kind of hard to tell who he is. But I think there are certain stylistic similarities of this picture with the image of a god whose name is Horus, who is in Shanut. Unfortunately, Shanut's doesn't seem to be translatable. On the right, there is a picture of Horus who's in Shanut. And I've shown him here, this particular image of him, because he's similarly kind of laying on top of a box with a head inside. He's not actually a lion. He's an image of a falcon-headed crocodile, but the posture is similar, and the box is actually quite analogous to the box that the lion is on. And there are other changes in this papyrus anyway. Horus, who is in Shnut, is inherently connected with the House of Life in a lot of texts. And he's actually one of the most referenced characters from Egyptian magical texts, and he's frequently associated with that place. In one particular ritual text called the Statement of the Butcher, he is kind of the protagonist in the festivals at Abydos, and he's the punisher of Seth and his accomplices. And there's actually a temple for Horus in Shnut, nearby Abydos, at a town called Soy, on modern-day Al-Mansha. And I think that this connection to the House of Life actually goes back to an earlier one found in Middle Kingdom texts, where they refer to characters involved in the festival named Horus of the North, Horus of Shen. The head found in the box is another strong connection between Horus and Shnut and that one image of the lion, because it is the box the lion is on that holds the statue of Sokar, that's head would be decapitated from one festival to the next. And so this statue is directly associated with the head depicted in these boxes of Horus and Shnut. Other demonic figures found in the House of Life were images to protect this object. This object is the Abydos standard, or sometimes called the Abydos fetish. It was a special container for the severed head of Osiris, as it was carried around in the parts of the festival from the time when it was kind of symbolically discovered in the desert until it was finally tied onto the body of the Khenti-Mentu statue in the House of Life. Interestingly, the Abydos standard was also a protective device, and there's a particular text that says it wards wandering demons off. At certain key moments in the festival, the Abydos standard was actually placed in a socket to hold it upright, and there are important depictions of this moment, such as the one found here in the stela of the priest named Wenefer, who is a royal scribe in the House of Life. And around the statue, the Abydos standard, there are images of 4 spitting cobras, again. These serpents are actually depicted frequently enough that you find their names, and the scholar Laurent Coulon has traced this imagery through many different temples, not just in Abydos. So they're another form of a protective demonic creature for this object. But the festival eventually left the House of Life, and it made a procession up into the desert, out to the symbolic tomb of Osiris called the House of Sokar, or the House of Provisions. This tomb can be identified as the tomb of the first dynasty king Jer. It was repurposed for this part of the festival. The statues of Osiris would remain in this tomb or near this tomb for a period of time, up to about 3 months, between one festival cycle and the next. And we have images of Osiris lying on a funerary bed that seem to depict this kind of transition between one festival and the next, and especially the rituals that were performed in the second festival, involving the kind of crying lamentations made by the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. And interestingly, these specific images that you find, for example, in Dendera Temple and in the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, actually show a bed that is directly associated with this event in Abydos. And in both places, you find below the bed, there are depictions of statues that take the form of demonic characters. For example, you see here, under the one in Dendera, there are 2 images of spitting cobras. And these represent the goddesses Mut and Naunet, and their role is again to protect Osiris while he's sleeping. And interestingly, these 2 statues also have an image of the god Bes that is equated to an image of a monkey, who's frequently represented as an archer, who protected the sun god. Nevertheless, all of these statues, again, are serving the purpose to protect Osiris in a weakened state when he's going from one festival to the next. Another demonic protector found around the tomb of Jer looks like this. It is an inscribed clay ball with the name of a goddess on it. Flinders Petrie actually excavated a number of these around the tomb of Jer. And what they are is very interesting because they correspond to clay balls that are mentioned as part of a ritual text called the Revelation of the Mystery of the 4 Balls. That text specifies that you need to inscribe the names of protective goddesses, such as Sekhmet, on these balls. And the ritual then involved throwing these balls in each of the cardinal directions, as you have an image of from from Karnak, here on the right. And these balls would then have been serving to cast away any potential evil forces from approaching the tomb. You also find these balls, interestingly, with other examples of the mummies of Osiris in certain places. Near to the tomb of Ger, the German archaeological mission at Abydos has recently found a set of 3 clay statues of Osiris. As Andrea and Uta Eflund have noted, these statues are made according to the description found in Papyrus Salt 825. And I would suggest that these figures correspond to the Sokar statue at Dendera, and it was then meant for these to wait from one festival to the next, or from one year to the next, for this statue then to furnish the head of the following year. And for some reason, these were left forgotten. But the important thing here is that they didn't just find these statues, they also found near them 4 little clay snakes, just like the snakes found at the gateway. And we've seen how these kinds of snakes are already used as protective beings for someone who's in a sleep or in a weakened state. And Kasia Spakowska has also drawn the inherent connection of these snakes, the snakes at the gateway and the snakes in Salt 825. It's kind of all part of the same traditions for protecting Osiris in Abydos specifically. So these kinds of snakes and their presence here fit nicely with the interpretation that these statues are waiting around, potentially asleep or in a state of kind of a torpid state, waiting to be used from one festival to the next. The last cycle of rituals in the festivals involved removing the Gentimentiu statue from the tomb of Ger. And this is the final and I think the most interesting part of the festival where demons play a role. At night, a select set of priests removed the statues and they took it in a procession to a secret spot in the desert called ARCE. This was an extremely secret and kind of mysterious area where you weren't supposed to go. If, for example, you were caught there without authorization, people could burn you alive. I think that this place is so secret that it still hasn't been found yet. Part of that protection for making it super secret was by associating it with guardian demons. The guardian demons who protected this place and similar places like it elsewhere in Egypt are called the Agathodaimones, which is just a Greek word meaning good demons. And they are depicted in 3 temples of the Greco-Roman period as a full team of gods who protect these cemeteries. And interestingly, Sylvie Coville has noted that 2 of the 3 Agathodaimones for Abydos have names that derive from the throne names of kings of the first dynasty who were buried at Omoga'ab. The Agathodaimones for Abydos are named Ichtawi or Ita and Hasti. And these actually correspond to the names for King Den and likely the King Jet, as you find them in the account of the chronology of Egypt written by Manetho. And so this fact demonstrates not only that there was kind of an ancient memory for the burial of these kings in the area of Moga, but I think it's a furthermore suggestion that there was a knowledge of the specific location of the tombs of these kings. And for that purpose, you should recall that these were marked by granite stelae, which may have still been present on the surface. The tombs of King Den and King Jet happened to be those that were situated very close to the tomb of King Ger, immediately to the south of it. And so they might have then been perceived as kind of guardians standing immediately at the transition of the area of the tomb to the area where a procession would make its way deeper into the desert, ultimately to go to that secret place, Arche. As Andrea Kusharek has noted, a text called the Great Decree of the Nome of the Silent Lands is directly associated with that night when the statue of Osiris was taken out of the tomb and buried in the Arche. And the hymn of this text has a kind of interesting textual structure in that it consists of a kind of a metaphorical procession where people bring Osiris through a series of gates. And at each gate, they sing kind of an address to the guardian of the gate, who's a demon. and they gain admittance into that gate, and they move on to the next one, ultimately to go to the last gate, the gate into the underworld. And if this was actually performed at that night of the last day of the festival in Abydos, then there's directly an image of an imagined landscape that they're evoking as they move through the desert, a landscape of gates and demons that ultimately leads to the underworld, where Osiris would reign as king. So this exploration of demons in God's land, specifically the festivals of Osiris and Abydos, has demonstrated a number of trends in the use of demons in ancient Egyptian ritual. The guardian demons in the festivals of Abydos were mostly creatures employed for the purpose of protecting Osiris at specific critical points in the festivals. These points were especially when the statues of the god were undergoing a transition related to healing, sleeping, being born, or being revived. And that's not really so surprising, since these kinds of demons are also being used in that way in magical and religious texts for the protection of real people. The lesson that they perhaps impart for us is that even in ancient Egyptian rituals that involved moving clay statues around, there was enough emotional investment in them that the rituals were treated as seriously as they were for real people. And one surprise is that the occurrence of the names of the kings of the first dynasty as guardian demons in the burial place of the Osiris statue. And these demonstrate that the demonic forces that could be invoked in these kinds of texts can come from anywhere. There's a plethora of traditions that might be invoked in creating magical creatures and coercing them to do things for you, both good and bad. Thank you.
Well, that was really interesting. Our last speaker today is Dr. Kostas Bukowska. She's currently the W. Benson Herrera Egyptology Scholar in Residence at Cal State San Bernardino. She is recently retired from Swansea University, where she was an associate professor of Egyptology. And her specializations look at religion in people's daily lives and the artifacts that they have to make their lives just a little bit better. I'm very excited about her talk today because it looks at essentially the ancient Egyptian pillow that is a headrest and all the benevolent demons that made your dreams good while you slept. She's entitled her talk, I Dream of Genie.
Welcome, and thank you for watching. Today, I offer you a glimpse of ancient Egyptian genie, beings that might seem a bit unfamiliar. I use the term genie here to distinguish them from major gods and to highlight the benevolent nature of these particular demons. Unlike the genie in the 1960s sitcom, our genie do not grant wishes, but they are intensely protective. And they are not contained in a bottle nor a lamp, at least not usually, but instead are contained on furniture and pillows. And while the 1960s genie was a rather attractive genie whom her master eventually married, ours are, well, let's just say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Although usually unnamed, helpful genie were often depicted, for drawing them was a way to literally materialize them into existence. They thus appear on a surprisingly broad range of artifacts, advertising their function as apotropaic devices, demon repellents in a sense. They appear on objects such as cosmetic containers, such as this one, cups. This one may have been used to feed an infant. Furniture, such as this bed leg, or at the top of a standard. This one is a finial that was probably placed on the top of a standard and held in a procession, perhaps the procession of Festival of Drunkenness or one dedicated to Hathor. And they appear on these specialized ivory wands as well. Today's discussion focuses on genie prevalent in Egypt's New Kingdom. That's the time of the great pharaohs such as Amenhotep III, his son Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and the various Ramses. Let's say around 1380 BCE. But to see where the idea for them originated, we need to go back about 600 years to about 1980 BCE. At that time, a veritable industry of objects and rituals dedicated to the protection of mothers and young children seems to abound. These include ivory wands. Made of hippopotamus tusks, they are carved with a parade of genii who seem to walk in a stately procession. Many of them are also armed, and when they are, they can hold knives in their foremost limbs. Here, an animated wasp scepter holds the knife in its monopodial appendage. The vulture grasps with their claw. The four-legged wild feline on the wand uses only its front paws. And the hippo being here has a knife on each forward limb, while the walking sun disk holds its knife on its forward foot only. At this time, one of the most popular genie, known as the Bez image, appears often. He is recognizable because he has these sort of bent legs, and although he is mostly human in form, he has also lion-like features. For example, he can have a mane and lion ears, and in this example, he has a pelt as well, and often a tail. Notably, during the Middle Kingdom, he does not hold a knife. Not on this wand, not anywhere, though he can hold and control snakes, such as in this example on a wand in Brussels. Sentinels and guardians, often armed, are found in other contemporary sources as well, such as the coffin texts. They are described in these illustrated compositions as noisy, bellowing beings, even as butchers, while they walk, stand, stomp their feet, or squat. In fact, one of the terms by which they are known is squatters. These are also well known in the New Kingdom and beyond as guardians of the afterlife, as for example, this one, which is from the Book of the Dead, for all you cat lovers out there. They look fierce, scary, evil, but their job was to maintain order and to keep out those people who do not belong. As the Middle Kingdom drew to a close, the use of the ivory wands faded away, and in the New Kingdom, we see genie pop up in a completely different context and with a whole new attitude. Now we find the genie's essence contained via carved images on furniture, such as this decorated banquet chair of Hatnefer, the mother of Senenmut from the reign of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. This footboard of Tutankhamun's bed includes a bez with wings and knives, as well as hippos and bezes in profile with knives. There would have been a comparable panel of images on the left side as well as the right, but I don't have a picture of that one. Their iconography changes as well. Rather than simply squatting or walking in a stately procession, these genie are fully armed. Their dynamic movement emphasized by their musculature and choreography. And it is this movement that distinguishes them from the major gods. They can also carry a range of weapons in their hands, mouths, and for the first time, they can even wield them on their feet or secondary limbs. Knives on feet are actually rare in ancient Egyptian art. On this Ramesside amulet, the hippo Ipi has knives on her feet, and knives do appear on the hind limbs of Tutu. But that deity is not seen until the Ptolemaic period, about 1,000 years after the time period I'm talking about. Not only are these kinds of images rare in ancient Egyptian art, it is also difficult to find examples of these foot knife entities in any culture. The phenomenon does not seem to occur in other contemporary Mediterranean cultures, nor is it obvious in religious iconography further afield. Even the Indian manifestations of Kali, Bhairava, Durga, famous for wielding a whole range of weapons in their many arms and parts of their body, do not use them on their feet. This particular idiosyncrasy of foot knives, along with the more animated dance movements, seems to begin sometime during the pleasant reign of Amenhotep III. The innovative artists of that time started a new trend in the presentation of the Bez image and other genie that would continue at least until the reign of Ramses II, but is rarely seen afterwards. It seems that the innovative artists at this time put them also on things like headrests. And one of the most intriguing objects that it's used on are these pillows. And yes, these were actually used as pillows, even today, by some African, East Asian, and Polynesian cultures. Relatively modern examples can be found in museums, including the Bowers Museum, and they range from short to what seem to be relatively tall at 16 centimeters. In these more modern cultures, they are used for sleeping as well as for supporting the head and for keeping elaborate hairstyles intact, and for resting while staying awake, which is something that herdsmen need to do, and for encouraging dreams. In ancient Egypt, they were used for sleeping, and, as we shall see, for protection. This one has a wish for good sleep running down the front, and on either side there are these genie that are fully armed, literally to the teeth, with spears and snakes and knives, again on their feet as well. The headdress of Kenher-Kopshef on one side here features the Bez image. Whoops, where is it? There it is, the Bez image wielding a snake, a pair of snakes in his mouth, a snake in his hand, and a spear. And on the other side, we also see a griffin and an armed lion as well, with snakes coming from his mouth. And that these objects belonged to men emphasizes the fact that these beings were not only called upon to protect fragile, vulnerable women and children and infants, but adults of either sex as well. A range of household objects feature the genie. This is the footboard of a bed that belonged to Yuya and Tuya, and it's decorated with a triptych panel of Bez images. The same tomb also contained a chair, which features an unusual rear-facing Bez image with wings and foot knives. And it's interesting here because the wings look like they would literally enfold the person who is sitting on the chair here. Here is another footboard from Tut's, another one of Tut's beds. And this is a gold ring that is said to be from Amarna that features a pair of schematic Bez images, still recognizable because of the bent legs and the headdress. And they again bear knives on their hands and feet. And all that remains of this wall painting in Deir el-Medina is a pair of feet, one of which has a knife as well. Even the Princess Sitamun had her chair decorated with Bez images and the hippo thing duo to ensure her safety. The emphasis is on their movement, the instruments they play, and their weaponry. Recall that the Bez image in the Middle Kingdom did not wield any knives at all. In addition, the facial expression is heavily emphasized at this time, to the point that the face of Bez appears as its own disembodied genie on the underside of the direct supportive headdress, amongst other objects. The furrowed brow, the deep labial lines, the tongue sticking out, and the glaring eyes, all are starkly and unambiguously portrayed. On those genii who show the entire body, the mouths can be open, expressing the idea of vocalization. Sometimes they seem to spit snakes. Snakes embody Heka, magical energy. In addition, rearing snakes spit venom that burns like fire, leading to the idea that they project flames, illuminating the darkness and annihilating any malevolent demons who come in the dark. And while most of the genie take the form of the easily recognizable Bez image, we have also seen them take the form of powerful animals such as hippos and lions, and hybrid ones exist as well. Ones with the head of a canine, or ones with the head of a crocodile, and the one on the far left there that has the head of what I think is meant to be a snake as well. Aside from the head, in each of these, the rest of the body, including the tail and the clothing worn, a kilt and either a sash or a crop top on the chest, are indistinguishable from those of the Bez images. And it is specifically these that actually show the most movement. Some, especially in full animal form, lean on a saw sign, the sign for protection. They convey the idea of an alert sentry, guarding. The Bez image can also be shown in his familiar frontal pose. In this case, the legs are nearly always bent in what would be called a plie in dance terms, or what I like to call a flexed stance. And by the way, these are not always male. These are on the same headrest base, and it wasn't until I started recording their features that I noticed that the one on the left is distinctly male with a little dangly thing between his legs, and the other is female with breasts, no dangly bit, and while she has just a false beard, the male has a full mane and beard as well. Some seem to remain deliberately ambiguous. The profile movement that they're in resembles the familiar smiting pose, and initially that is how I interpreted it. It seemed to me that they were mimicking the familiar pose of the pharaoh, symbolically smiting the enemy and restoring order from chaos. However, closer examination suggests that the entities are in the throes of a dance, as has already been suggested by others as well. And if you look at the profile movements here, they're really more energetic than the usual smiting pose, with the front knee more bent and the arms positioned either with both up in front, or one up in back and one up in front, and the one in back can be up or down. This is the same pose that the Bez image uses when he's patently dancing, such as when he holds a tambour, a type of drum. Other headrests show the dynamism of movement even more clearly, such as this one from the Louvre, where you can see the Bez image actually right in the process of moving forward rather energetically. This one clarifies the movement further, with both hands raised up to grasp the snakes as weapons, and he's literally high-stepping and cavorting along. Here's a headdress that I've never actually seen. The publication says that it is in Marseille, but notice again the different dynamic poses of the two Bez images. That one there, again, with his legs raised up really, really high and clearly in motion, and the other one actually turning his head right around with the snakes coming out as well. As for the knives that the genie wields, most are not weapons of war, but rather they match the shape of those used for butchery. These butcher knives are commonly seen in the hands of humans slaughtering animals, as well as in the hands of deities, the guardians, and even determinatives. This knife, is an icon of butchery, a signifier that explicitly indicates not massacre, which implies human victims, but rather the concepts of slaughter, cut, dismember, butcher, punish. The enemy in these cases is not even provided the dignity of being treated as a worthy adversary or opponent in battle. Instead, it is treated as a pest, worthy only of slaughter. And because the exception proves the rule, I'm not really sure what that saying means, but here is a genie I noticed recently on a headrest in the Penn Museum, wielding a butcher knife in one hand and the kepish sword of courage in the other. This ceremonial blade is here being provided to the pharaoh Amenhotep II by the god Amun. And actually, Amenhotep explains in a text that the god gave him a kepish sword for courage in a dream. And if knives held in hands are effective, then placing them on feet magnifies their power. The fiery snakes in their hands, arms, and mouths augment their power even more. One text reads, "I am strong enough to cut off heads, and sharp is the flame which is in my mouth against the knives which are in the hands of the Neteru." Triptychs, such as those found on a chair and on a footboard in KV 46, suggest that what might be represented here are 3 dance steps: stomp to the side, face forward, stomp to the other side, and back again. Character movement coach and animator Betsy Abydos introduced me to the idea recently of eccentric dance, rooted in antiquity and in pantomimic movement. It implements, she says, a very specific repertoire of steps, and it's wrapped around parody of character in a visual narrative. If you visit her website, you can actually see these fully animated as well. While today's eccentric dance is comic in intent, just think of Charlie Chaplin, the fact that our genie wield deadly implements reveals a story where the intent is protection of the vulnerable. While an individual rests or sleeps, the genies stand guard, ready to furiously drive off and threaten any potential agents of chaos with total slaughter and annihilation, using a type of warrior dance. One striking example of a dance that evokes many of the same elements, down to the details of facial expressions, stance, physique, and even the loincloths and kilts that are worn, is the haka. And I'm not stating any diffusion here, just showing similarities in how our genie may have moved. This was no erotic nor balletic dance. This was a passionate and defiant warrior's challenge. But the plane in which our genie dance is guarded is not the earthly one. It is rather the liminal zone, where deities, hostile demons, and benevolent genie congregate. The borders are guarded by genie who await alert and watchful, yet casually resting on a saw sign which both explicitly defines their function and is a protective force in and of itself. These beings required no explicit spells, no words were required to invoke them. They acted of their own volition and agency to protect their wards. So if you find yourself beset in the night by a mischievous, malignant demon coming to invade your sleep, hopefully your personal deity will spring to your defense and bring you good dreams instead. In the words of the genie themselves, inscribed on a headrest, we come to protect and give you life. And with that, I thank you and hope you enjoyed this little glimpse of the imaginal realm of ancient Egyptian beings.